David Carter walked slowly through the leaf-covered streets of Boston, where the early winter chill crept into every corner of the city. Twilight had just begun to fall, and David was on his way to his part-time shift at the old bookstore on Beacon Street, a place he had been attached to for the past 3 years. David was a final-year medical student at Boston Medical University, one of the most prestigious schools, but behind the glamour of that title lay days filled with relentless stress. The expensive tuition fees and living costs kept David constantly in a state of financial strain. More pressing than anything was his mother's health, Linda Carter, the woman who had dedicated her entire life to raising her son. His mother was in the final stages of cancer. The endless rounds of chemotherapy not only drained her strength, but also depleted the little money David managed to earn. To David, Linda was everything. Someone he would trade anything to keep by his side a little longer. David's days were a constant cycle. By day, he interned at the hospital, learning to face life and death, and by night, he buried himself in piles of old books and unpaid bills. The bookstore where he worked was a small shop nestled modestly among the old buildings. A weathered wooden sign with the words Monroe's Bookstore hung on the glass door, standing as a witness to time. Inside, the smell of aged paper and pine wood blended together, creating a tranquil atmosphere, as if time had paused among the bookshelves. David loved this place, not because of the meager wages it provided, but for the peace and the feeling of stepping into another world, where the burdens of life momentarily subsided. Since working there, David had encountered many interesting customers, but none as remarkable as Elizabeth Monroe. Elizabeth Monroe was an enigmatic woman. At 71, she retained a graceful demeanor and sharpness that few could match. Each time she appeared, she was dressed in elegant, expensive coats, wearing lambskin gloves and a custom-made felt hat. Her appearance exuded wealth, not ostentatious but the kind of mysterious affluence, as if she had stepped out of the classic novels David used to read. At first, David saw her as just another regular customer. She visited the bookstore every week, always seeking rare literature or old editions. However, over time, David realized Elizabeth was more than just a book lover. She enjoyed conversation, not idle small talk, but deep discussions, often delving into topics David rarely shared with strangers. "David, have you ever read The Great Gatsby?" she asked one evening as David was rearranging the shelves. "Yes, I read it during my first year. It's one of my favorites," David replied, smiling lightly. "Do you see yourself in Gatsby?" she asked, peering at him through silver-rimmed glasses, her gaze penetrating as if she could see through his thoughts. David chuckled softly but felt a slight unease. "I think Gatsby lived for dreams too far out of reach. I'm a bit more grounded." Elizabeth said nothing more, but her eyes seemed to hold on to David's words. Every time they met afterward, she gently steered their conversations toward his personal life, a growing interest. After several encounters, David began to notice Elizabeth's particular interest in him. She often asked about his studies, his mother, and once even asked directly, "How do you manage the tuition and your mother's medical expenses?" David paused, taken aback. It was a question he hadn't expected from her, as he always tried to appear strong and hide his struggles. "I'm managing fine, ma'am. I work here and at a few other places," David answered, keeping his tone composed. But Elizabeth wasn't easily convinced. "You're a good young man, David, but sometimes people need to accept help." Her words echoed in David's mind that night. He wondered why she cared so much. Did she see something in him that reminded her of the past? Or was there a secret Elizabeth was keeping that David had yet to uncover? Whatever the reason, David was certain of one thing. Elizabeth Monroe's presence would soon change his life forever. Under the warm yellow light of the bookstore, David carefully arranged the old novels on the shelf. It was past 8 in the evening, and the bookstore was about to close. But Elizabeth Monroe still sat in her usual corner, slowly flipping through the pages of an old leather-bound book as if time did not exist. The soft rustling of pages blended with the sound of David's pencil scratching against the inventory ledger, creating a quiet, peaceful symphony. David glanced at the clock on the wall, preparing to remind Elizabeth of the closing hour, but before he could speak, she gently placed the book down. "David," Elizabeth called, her voice warm but carrying an unusual seriousness. David looked up, his eyes meeting the deep gaze of hers, a gaze that seemed to pierce through the layers of defenses within him. "Would you like to find another book tonight, ma'am?" David smiled politely, trying to keep the atmosphere light. Elizabeth didn't respond immediately. She stood up, slowly making her way toward the register where David stood. Her every step seemed to stretch longer than usual, each one carrying a weight of unspoken words. "David, have you ever thought about marriage?" she asked, her eyes resting on his youthful face. David froze for a moment, letting out a soft chuckle, thinking it was just a casual question meant to break the silence. "I think that's still far away for me, ma'am. I have tuition, internships, and my mother to take care of," he replied gently. Elizabeth nodded slightly, as if she had anticipated his answer, but she didn't stop there. "David, marry me within 6 months." The air seemed to still. David stared at her, certain he had misheard. "Pardon me, ma'am. What did you say?" "Marry me," Elizabeth repeated, her voice calm but firm, as if she were proposing a business deal rather than a marriage. David forced a smile, trying to find humor in her words. "You're joking, right?" I'm entirely serious." Elizabeth's eyes were cold yet sincere as she examined David's expression, her words lingering in the quiet space. "If you agree, I will pay off all your tuition, cover your mother's medical bills, and secure your future after graduation. In return, I want someone to accompany me during the final years of my life. And an heir." David stood frozen. Elizabeth's words echoed in his mind, clear and undeniable. "You want an heir? But why me?" Elizabeth gave a faint smile, but there was no jest in it. "Because you're the only person I feel I can trust." David remained silent, his heart conflicted. Why would she trust someone like him? He was just a struggling student with nothing to offer except determination and endless work. "I'm not asking for anything difficult. Just accompany me to social events, share meals with me, and be present when I need you. It's that simple." David lowered his head, his hand unconsciously tightening around the edge of the register counter. Part of him wanted to refuse immediately, but another part, deeper within, wrestled with the decision. "I don't expect you to decide right now," Elizabeth continued gently. "Take your time, but I believe you will make the right choice." That night, David returned to his small apartment. As he opened the door, the sight of his mother, Linda, lying on the single bed greeted him. Her face was pale, thinner than before. David's heart tightened. Elizabeth's proposal haunted him throughout the night. No matter how hard he tried to dismiss it, every glance at his mother reminded him that he was facing an unavoidable decision. A week later, David stepped through the bookstore doors once more. Elizabeth was there, waiting, as if she knew he would return. David approached, took a deep breath, and met her gaze directly. "I accept." Under the thin veil of early autumn morning mist, the wedding of David Carter and Elizabeth Monroe took place quietly in the garden behind the vast estate. There were no vibrant bouquets or large crowds of guests, only a few of Elizabeth's close confidants, an old lawyer, and the gardener, standing at a distance, seemingly more out of curiosity than joy. David stood beside Elizabeth, fully aware of the stark contrast between them. His bride was a woman in her 70s, her face partially hidden beneath a hat with a delicate veil. Her eyes were deep and inscrutable, carrying an intelligence and authority that David had never encountered in anyone else. As the minister read the vows, David glanced at her. Elizabeth stood tall, her expression unmoved. For her, this seemed more like a necessary ritual than a moment of emotion or happiness. The exchange of rings passed swiftly. When David slipped the silver band onto her slender finger, he felt the coldness of her skin. That evening, David moved into Monroe Manor, a place he was now the legal owner of by title. Yet he felt completely out of place. The estate sat isolated on a hilltop, and the entrance required a long walk down a stone-paved path lined with ancient trees that had aged with time. From afar, David gazed at the grand mansion, draped in a solemn, almost gloomy stillness. As the large front doors opened, David was greeted by a middle-aged butler named Robert. His sharp yet cautious eyes seemed to scrutinize David's every move. Mr. Carter, allow me to show you to your room, Robert said. David lifted his suitcase and followed Robert down the long wooden hallway. Portraits hung along the walls on either side, but the eyes within the paintings seemed to follow him with every step. A strange, unsettling feeling crept over David. You may use any room in the manor, except for those that have been locked as per Mrs. Monroe's instructions, Robert remarked without turning back. David frowned. Why are they locked? Robert hesitated for a brief moment before replying. It was the former master's wish. He did not want anyone entering those rooms. David didn't press further. He stepped into the room prepared for him, a spacious yet modest chamber, lacking the extravagance he had imagined. However, the air within carried a lingering coldness, as if no one had lived there for a long time. The first days following the wedding passed slowly and heavily. Elizabeth was often absent, spending most of her days in her study, a room David was never permitted to enter. He spent much of his time walking in the garden or reading in the mansion's expansive library. Yet what troubled David most were the strange occurrences at night. The first time, he awoke in the middle of the night with a sense of unease. David heard footsteps echoing through the hallway, steady and slow, but they never stopped at any door. When he opened his own door to check, the corridor was completely empty. Maybe I imagined it, David reassured himself. But the following night the footsteps returned, closer this time, as if just outside his door. The next morning David asked Robert, "Does anyone in the house walk around at night?" Robert paused for a brief second, his eyes avoiding David's gaze. "No, sir. All staff leave the main house after 9 p.m. Only I remain." "Have you heard footsteps at night?" Robert shook his head. "No, Mr. Carter. Perhaps you mistook the wind or the creaking branches." David detected hesitation in Robert's voice, but chose not to pursue the matter further. Beyond the mysterious footsteps, David noticed the locked rooms throughout the manor. As he wandered the hallways, he counted at least 3 doors secured with heavy locks. David once asked Elizabeth about them, but she merely smiled cryptically. "Some doors are best left closed forever, David." She said no more. The other servants also kept their distance from David. They worked in silence, avoiding eye contact or any unnecessary conversation, as if there was an invisible boundary between them and him. David tried to adapt, but the heavy silence within the manor made him feel like an outsider, despite being the husband of its mistress. One evening, as David sat reading in the library, Elizabeth walked in. She quietly took a seat in the chair opposite him, her eyes piercing deeply into his. "How do you feel living here?" she asked softly. "Strange, and somewhat uncomfortable," David replied honestly. "This house seems to hold something I haven't been able to understand." Elizabeth smiled as if she had anticipated this answer. "This manor holds many memories, David. Not everyone adapts to it right away." She rose and walked toward the door, but before leaving, Elizabeth turned back. "Don't worry, I'll tell you what you need to know when the time is right." David remained seated, the light in the library growing dim as night descended. He felt it clearly. He had stepped into an entirely different world, one where secrets seemed to slowly reveal themselves behind each locked door. Under the pale afternoon sunlight, David walked along the long corridors of Monroe Manor. Since moving in, he had grown accustomed to the vast, cold space, but the feeling lingered that the house concealed more secrets than met the eye. One afternoon, while wandering the second floor, he stopped in front of an old room he had barely noticed before. The dark wooden door was slightly ajar, revealing a small glimpse of the room inside. Curious, David gently pushed the door open and stepped in. The room smelled of age, wood, and damp paper. Sunlight filtered through thick curtains, casting shadows over carefully arranged antiques. A large bookshelf rested against the left wall, and to the right, a long, unused fireplace stood. But what caught David's attention was the large portrait hanging in the center of the room. It was a painting of a middle-aged man with deep eyes, slightly wavy black hair, and a prominent nose. His features bore an uncanny resemblance to David. Approaching closer, David felt as though the painting was staring back at him. "This can't be," David whispered, puzzled. Below the portrait, a small inscription on the frame read, "Edgar Monroe, 1945. David furrowed his brow. The name was unfamiliar, but the face, Footsteps echoed behind him, cutting through his thoughts. Elizabeth stood at the doorway, silently watching David from afar. "You found it, haven't you?" she said, her voice calm, showing no surprise. David turned to her, his gaze questioning. "Who is this man? He looks just like me." Elizabeth entered the room, her eyes briefly flicking over the portrait before she turned toward the window. A faint smile formed on her lips, though it held no trace of joy. "Edgar was my husband," she replied steadily. "He passed away many years ago." David's brow furrowed. "And he looked this much like me?" Elizabeth turned back, her gaze unreadable. "Sometimes life brings strange coincidences, David. Don't think too much about it." "You know this is hard to believe, right?" David's voice carried undeniable doubt. "I look like him, as if we're family." Elizabeth remained silent, as if weighing her words carefully. Then she stepped closer, gently placing a hand on David's shoulder. "David," she said softly, "everyone has their secrets. When the time is right, you'll understand everything. For now, don't let this distract you." Her words did little to ease David's curiosity. They only deepened it. After that encounter, David began paying closer attention to the details within the manor. Each evening, whether sitting in the library or passing through the long corridors, he felt eyes watching him. It wasn't his imagination. David was certain something in the house wanted to reveal itself. One morning, while tidying the desk in the drawing room, David discovered an old photograph wedged behind a drawer. Carefully, he pulled it out and recognized it as a picture from the 1950s. In the photo stood a young Elizabeth beside a man whose face mirrored David's, Edgar Monroe. His heart raced. Something was undeniably off, yet he couldn't explain it. That evening, David brought the photo to the sitting room where Elizabeth was enjoying her tea. "Mrs. Monroe, I found this." Elizabeth took the photo, studying it for a long time. Her eyes drifted far away, as if revisiting a distant memory. "This was taken in the southern garden of the manor," she said, her fingers brushing over Edgar's face in the photo. David sat across from her, his tone serious. "Do you think there's any connection between Edgar and me?" Elizabeth looked at David, her eyes gentle yet enigmatic. "Do you believe that everything in life happens by coincidence?" David remained silent. "I don't believe in coincidences," Elizabeth continued. "You came here, met me, and became part of this place. That's no accident, David." David didn't know how to respond. It was clear Elizabeth knew something, but she wasn't ready to reveal it. From that day on, David felt as though a veil had been drawn over his new life. He frequently passed by Edgar's portrait, feeling as if the man in the painting whispered to him each time he walked by. The more David pondered the resemblance, the more convinced he became that it wasn't mere coincidence. Yet despite his efforts, he couldn't grasp the truth, because Elizabeth, the only one who knew everything, seemed determined to keep her secret to the very end. On the 7th night after the wedding, under the dim glow of the lights, David awoke with a start. In the stillness of Monroe Manor, he could clearly sense the presence of someone nearby. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and his heart pounded as if it would leap out of his chest. He sat up, scanning the large room, but everything remained as it was. No one was there. Only the steady ticking of the old clock on the wall and the faint light from the hallway cast shadows across the room. David exhaled softly, silently chiding himself for being overly sensitive. Since moving into Elizabeth Monroe's mansion after their wedding, strange occurrences had become part of his daily life. However, tonight, the unease was more intense than ever. He got up, draped a thin wool sweater over his shoulders, and stepped into the hallway. The hallway light flickered briefly before illuminating the row of antique portraits lining the walls. The faces in the paintings seemed to follow his every step. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet. As he passed the staircase leading to the basement, David stopped. A door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. David frowned. Elizabeth was always careful to keep every door in the mansion locked, especially the basement door. On multiple occasions, David had asked about the mystery surrounding the area, but she would gently avoid the subject and firmly forbid him from entering. So why was the door open now? Curiosity overtook him, and David quietly descended. The basement was cold and dark. David fumbled for the light switch. The faint yellow light flickered to life, slowly illuminating the vast room. What appeared on the opposite wall made David freeze. Before him hung dozens of portraits, each depicting a man who looked exactly like him. David stepped closer, his trembling fingers brushing the dust on the frames. Some paintings had faded, their strokes aged, but there was no mistaking it. The man in the portraits was him, or someone who bore an uncanny resemblance. Beneath each painting was a date, spanning from 20 to 30 years ago. Some bore marks of time, proving they had been painted long before his arrival. David swallowed hard. He felt as though he had stumbled into another world, one where past and present intertwined, leaving him utterly bewildered. "You found them!" David jumped and turned around. Elizabeth stood at the door, her gaze fixed on the portraits as if she had been anticipating this moment for a long time. "Can you explain this?" David asked, his voice trembling. Elizabeth entered the room, her hand grazing one of the portraits, her eyes brimming with nostalgia. "David," she began softly, "you look so much like Edgar Monroe, my late husband, that it's almost unbelievable." David stiffened. Elizabeth continued, her voice lowering. "Edgar was the love of my life. He passed away 30 years ago in a car accident. I have lived in loneliness ever since that day." David remained silent, feeling the weight of her sorrow in every word. "When I first saw you at the bookstore," Elizabeth's eyes locked onto David's, "I couldn't look away. You resembled Edgar so much. I thought he had returned." David lowered his head, and the paintings before him suddenly felt haunting. "When did you paint these?" he asked. Elizabeth paused for a moment before sighing. "I started painting Edgar's portraits while he was still alive. After he passed, I continued, from memory and imagination. But no matter how hard I tried, the paintings always felt incomplete." She stopped, her hand trembling over the most recent portrait, the one of David, completed only a few months ago. "Until I met you, David. You are the piece I've been searching for over the past 30 years. You are my last chance to feel that he is still here." David took a step back, his heart heavy. "Do you think I'm Edgar reincarnated?" Elizabeth gently shook her head. "No, I'm not delusional. I know you are David Carter, not Edgar. But I cannot let go of this feeling again." She moved closer to him, her voice trembling. "David, I've lived 30 years in solitude. Every day I wake up to empty walls, and every night I return to bed feeling the same emptiness. I can't bear to continue like this." David stood in silence. For the first time, he realized that behind her strong exterior and wealth lay a frail, aging woman yearning for companionship in her final days. "You are the only one who can fill that void," Elizabeth said softly, her voice weak. "I don't want to leave this world alone, and with you here, I can face old age without fear." David looked at her, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. "You've been incredibly strong to endure 30 years alone," David said quietly. "Don't you think you can manage a little longer?" Elizabeth gave a faint, sorrowful smile. "Perhaps, but I don't want to test myself any further." In the dim light of the basement, David stood still, gazing at the portrait of himself. Dozens of paintings surrounded him, as if each one was a fragment of a story he had never known. Behind him, Elizabeth remained still, her hand gently brushing the frame of an old painting, her eyes lingering on a portrait of Edgar Monroe, her late husband. As David turned to leave the room, he suddenly realized the door had closed. He stepped forward quickly, trying the handle, but it didn't budge. "Elizabeth, did you lock the door?" he asked, trying to stay calm, though his voice carried a hint of tension. From behind him, Elizabeth's voice echoed softly, tinged with sorrow. "David, please don't leave." David turned back to face Elizabeth. Her eyes glistened, and her trembling hand gripped the key tightly. "What are you doing? Open the door," he said, keeping his tone measured. Elizabeth shook her head, her voice turning hoarse. "I know this may seem strange, but I only have 1 month left to live." Her words froze David in place. "1 month?" he asked, eyes widening. Elizabeth nodded slowly. She stepped closer and sat down on the wooden chair by the door, as if the weight on her shoulders had become heavier than ever. "I've been diagnosed with terminal cancer. The doctors told me I don't have much time." David remained silent. The room suddenly felt stifling. "I'm not afraid of death, David," Elizabeth continued, "but I'm terrified of facing it alone. For the past 30 years, I've lived by myself in this house, with nothing but memories of Edgar. Every night I dream of him, but when I wake up, it's just me and these cold walls." Elizabeth looked up at David, her eyes trembling, more fragile than ever. "You are the only one who makes me feel like Edgar is still here. David, I beg you, stay with me until I'm gone." David stood frozen. He couldn't deny that something in Elizabeth's words struck deep within him. She was no longer a wealthy, powerful woman, but a fragile human being, fearful of loneliness, just like anyone else. David thought of his mother, the woman lying in a hospital bed, also alone in her final days. He understood that feeling. "Elizabeth, he began, but the words trailed off. Elizabeth smiled gently, though tears rolled down her cheeks. "I don't expect you to love me or see me as family. I just want someone by my side, so I won't have to face death in silence." David looked deeply into her eyes. The sincerity in her words made it impossible for him to walk away. After a long silence, David slowly stepped forward and sat beside Elizabeth. "All right," he said softly. "I'll stay." Elizabeth gazed at him, and her eyes brightened, even if just a little. "Thank you, David." David knew this wasn't an easy decision, but he couldn't turn his back on this woman, someone who had spent 30 years living in the shadows of loneliness and longing. Even though he didn't fully understand everything that was happening, deep down, David felt that staying was the right thing to do. Here's the translation of your text into English. After that night, Elizabeth no longer locked the secret room or any other door in the mansion. The invisible barrier between her and David gradually disappeared, leaving behind a gentler atmosphere in the house, once shrouded in coldness and loneliness. Every morning, Elizabeth and David sat by the breakfast table under the soft sunlight streaming through the large windows. Their conversations became more natural. Elizabeth told David about her youth, about the happy days when she was with Edgar Monroe, the man she loved with all her heart. Every morning, Edgar would sit in this very chair, she said, gently placing her hand on the chair beside David. He loved reading the newspaper, though he never really cared about the news. I think he just wanted an excuse to sit longer, sipping his coffee. David smiled softly. He could feel the deep love she had for Edgar through every word she spoke. In the afternoons, they walked together through the garden behind the mansion, a place Elizabeth said was Edgar's favorite. The garden was filled with roses, their vibrant red petals glowing under the afternoon sun. Edgar always loved roses, Elizabeth said as she slowly walked along the gravel path. He used to say that roses symbolize love that never fades. David watched as she carefully pruned a rose, a peaceful glimmer in her eyes he had never seen before. "Do you tend to this garden every day?" David asked, reaching out to hold the branch of roses Elizabeth had just cut. She nodded, smiling faintly. "Yes, every morning, rain or shine, I come out here. It's my way of keeping Edgar with me." David suddenly realized that the portraits she painted weren't a sign of obsession or stubbornness. It was Elizabeth's way of holding on to the husband she cherished. The paintings and the garden were two small worlds she created to fill the emptiness in her heart. "Losing the person you love the most is never easy," Elizabeth said, her eyes following the petals gently falling to the ground. "Have you ever loved someone that deeply, David?" David froze at the question. He thought of his mother, the woman he loved most in the world, but he had never experienced a love like Elizabeth's for Edgar. "I'm not sure," he replied honestly, "but I understand the fear of losing someone you love." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes drifting toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. "You make me feel as if Edgar is still here, David. I'm truly grateful for that." Her voice was as light as the breeze passing through, but in every word David felt sincerity and warmth. He began to understand that Elizabeth wasn't a lonely woman blindly clinging to the past. She was simply someone who had lost everything and was trying to hold on to the most precious memories of her life. Through those afternoons together, David felt a change within himself. The atmosphere in the mansion gradually became more comforting. The mysterious footsteps in the night seemed to vanish, and David no longer felt anxious or fearful around Elizabeth. Perhaps loneliness only truly exists when no one is willing to listen, and David in some way had become the person Elizabeth needed in the final days of her life. 1 month later, on an autumn morning, David woke up to an unusual silence in the mansion. Normally, Elizabeth would be sitting at the breakfast table, sipping coffee and quietly reading a book. But today, the chair beside him was empty. David walked to Elizabeth's bedroom, where soft sunlight filtered through the thin curtains. She lay on the bed, her face peaceful as if she had drifted into a deep sleep. Her hand gently rested on the portrait of Edgar Monroe that David had found in the secret room before. She had passed away in peace. David sat quietly by her bedside for a long time, feeling an inexplicable sense of loss. Though their relationship began with doubt and hesitation, over time, he had learned to understand and appreciate Elizabeth. She was not a ruthless or cunning wealthy woman, but simply a lonely soul who had lived for 30 years in the shadow of memories and longing. A few days after the modest funeral, Elizabeth's personal lawyer met with David, handing him a thick envelope. "She left everything to you, David," the lawyer said, passing him the will. David opened the envelope and saw his name clearly written on every inheritance document. The mansion, investments, and even the valuable art collection now belonged to him. David stood in silence. He had never expected this. Looking around the vast mansion, now empty except for himself, David felt the same emptiness Elizabeth had lived with for so many years. Living in this space without companionship, he realized that all the wealth in the world could not fill the void of loneliness. After many nights of reflection, David made a decision. He sold the mansion and most of the assets Elizabeth had left him. With the proceeds, he founded a small hospital named after Elizabeth Monroe, dedicated to patients who could not afford medical care. It was his way of honoring and remembering the woman who had changed his life. On the hospital's opening day, David stood before the new sign, watching as the first patients entered. In his heart, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if Elizabeth was watching over him and smiling from afar. The story began with a strange proposal, a marriage without love, but filled with empathy and companionship. Through the days they spent together, David and Elizabeth found a connection they never anticipated. David was not only someone who had been helped, he became someone who brought meaning and light to Elizabeth's final days. Their story stands as proof of the power of compassion and human connection. Sometimes a small act of kindness or sincere companionship can be the greatest gift to someone drowning in loneliness. David changed his life, but more importantly, he helped Elizabeth find peace in her heart, something she had lost for 3 decades. That chance encounter blossomed into a profoundly touching story, leaving an everlasting mark on both their lives. Thank you for listening to our story. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories.